I'd like to begin with Director General Okonjo-Iweala. Perhaps the greatest lesson we've learned out of this pandemic in ways that are positive and negative is how terribly interdependent the world is. No matter how much everyone would like to pretend that we're all on our own, or our family, our community, our nation is on its own, we are, for good or ill, interdependent. And therefore, we have to define the terms of it. So, to date, we know that interdependence has given us an enormous amount of growth, a big reduction in extreme poverty, but still persistent patterns of inequality. So, how did this happen? To what extent is this an inevitable product of global economic interdependence?
Well, thank you, President Clinton. It's a pleasure to be with you on this panel. I think you're absolutely right that, we've seen enormous interdependence in the world now, especially when we talk about problems of the global commons like the pandemic, climate change, and so on. But let me say that on your comment on economic interdependence, this was really something for the good. From about 1990 to 2019, we saw many trade agreements, multilateral and bilateral and regional. We saw the integration of China, the East European countries, some other parts of South Asia, increasingly getting into the global multilateral trading system. And I think that this interdependence helped to lift so many millions of people, 1 billion actually, out of poverty. We saw the development of global supply chains as a result of this. And the numbers are that the number of people living in extreme poverty fell from about 36% in 1990 or so to less than 10% before the pandemic struck. So really, this interdependence helped to lift people out of poverty, helped nations to converge towards more equality. But during that convergence, you're right, there were those who were left behind. There were poor people within rich countries who did not benefit. There were poor countries who were not brought into this mainstream of globalization. But does that mean that this interdependence is bad? No, I think we can still use the same instruments in what I call re-globalization to try to bring those who are marginalized back. And you can see during this time, vulnerable countries have suffered during the pandemic. They are at the end of the vaccine queue. Those countries manufacturing it have not been able to share to the extent we would like. But still, we know that given the interdependence of supply chains, which are not easy to unravel, we need to find a way to use this to bring people into the mainstream, to bring those who have been left behind. So in summary, President Clinton, I think interdependence, yes, can result in vulnerable people being marginalized, but it can also be an instrument to bring them back and give them access to those markets that are wealthier than the ones they have at home or in their region.
Secretary Raimondo, I know you well enough to know that you agree with what she just said, but how are we going to do it? One of the big problems that is dividing America and undermining our ability to play a really constructive role in the world is that there's so much controversy and difference of opinion about what to do with our interdependence here at home. So what do you think is most perpetuating inequality here, and what should we be doing about it right now?
First of all, it's wonderful to see you, President Clinton. Would love to be able to see you in person sometime soon. And it's really an honor to be on such a distinguished panel on such an important topic. So it's great to be with all of you. The first thing is we have to get real about how bad it is. It's one thing, we all know the statistic, the top 20% of US households bring in more income than the bottom 4/5 combined. So what does that mean? That means we have a lot of people working full-time in poverty. It means kids not really getting a chance, going to schools that are falling apart, a lot of human suffering, a lot of unfairness. And it's truly, as President Biden says, we're in a fight for the soul of America. And I think that's true. So the first thing is not to sugarcoat how bad this is. The second thing is there's no one thing, and you obviously know this from your time as governor and as president. There are just barriers that are holding back people of color, women, people in rural America, people in inner cities. And we have to systematically make investments to reduce the barriers. It's no one thing. We need huge investments in affordable housing. You can't do well in school if you're sleeping on your friend's couch the night before or in a car the night before. It's not going to happen. So we need investments in housing. We need to make sure that all of the innovation and tech jobs that are fueling the bubble economies on the coast get to middle America. And that means job training and skills and digital apprenticeships all over America. So folks everywhere have the skills they need to get those jobs. By the way, it means starting that education earlier. The year before I became governor in Rhode Island, 0 kids of color took the AP computer science test in public schools in Rhode Island. So, we started an initiative to make sure we became the first state in the country to teach computer science in every public school, in every grade, starting in kindergarten. If you ever want to put a smile on your face, go watch first graders learning how to sort themselves as preparation for learning sorting for computer science. These kids are smart. It's not the fact that they're poor or black or brown that's not why they weren't taking computer science. They weren't exposed to it. It wasn't taught in their schools. And if they're not exposed to digital skills, they're not going to get the high-paying jobs that require digital skills, and they're going to be left behind. I think it's broad-based investments, the kind that President Biden is calling for right now, investments in childcare, so women can participate in the workforce. Tens of millions of women of color are working full-time every week, some of them 60, 70 hours a week, doing childcare jobs, taking care of elderly loved ones as CNAs, but they make $10, $11 an hour and they're poor. So we need to make investments so they can, have a dignified job with a decent wage. So in any event, I think there's too few people, and primarily white people, primarily in the cities, who have access to high-tech, high-wage jobs. And it's time that we break down the barriers so all Americans can have that, so they have a chance at working and making a decent living.
Thank you. I should note, for the benefit of the people listening and for the other panelists, that Secretary Raimondo, when she was governor of Rhode Island during the financial crash, governed one of the states hardest hit. And depending on what measurement she used, they were always in the top 3. And she somehow managed to hold them together, deliver all the bad medicine that the Director General is familiar with from her 2 stints as a finance minister of Nigeria, and still maintain enough popularity to get herself reelected by telling people the truth and letting people understand that they did have a future. And I think we should never forget that how we do this is also important, because that determines how people respond. President Bostic, you have been amazingly vocal for someone running the Federal Reserve Bank, yours in Atlanta, that we have an imperative to end systemic racism in the way we manage our economy, and especially the way capital flows. Tell us what you're doing and how you think it can reduce inequality.
Well, thank you, President Clinton. And it's really, I'll echo Secretary Raimondo. This is a a real pleasure to be on this panel. First thing I did want to say is I think it's really important that everyone understand that systemic racism, and indeed any structure or institution that restricts opportunity based on a person's skin color or their family connections or any of those sorts of things, is an economic issue, because it constrains the access to opportunity, and it really limits the ability of people and communities of achieving their full potential. And if they don't achieve their full potential, we all lose, because we have smaller economies than we should, and we have less resilient economies than we should. So this is actually a very important thing. In terms of what we're doing at the Fed, the first thing we're doing is we're really pointing out that this is a thing. Like, this is actually a problem, and it has real impacts. As I've gone around, I've been surprised and a little disappointed at how few people know that the history of discrimination, of limiting access to home ownership and things that really have long-term implications. So just putting that spotlight on is really important. A second thing I would say is that we are working with partners to try to make a positive change in the world, to try to start to show the effects and the solutions. We're working with the Markle Foundation and others to rework workforce development initiatives and try to really change that infrastructure. We actually have an initiative where we're trying to change the incentives and support programs that we call Advancing Careers in Low-Income Families, because we know that the structures and the incentives that are put out really do tell people, don't get that extra dollar of income, don't get that extra bit of education, and that doesn't serve us very well. And here in Atlanta, we're working with the Metro Atlanta Chamber to get every business to see racial equity as something that's particularly important. I would also say that we're working in research, and we're trying to promote the things that we're learning from work that's being done both in-house and by others that really do start to make an understanding about how policies and programs are making a positive change here. So we're really trying as much as possible to get conversations moving forward. The last thing I'll say on this is that one thing that I'm very excited about and very proud about is the Federal Reserve System has been standing up something that we call the Racism in the Economy webinar series. We really try to bring together people to have interesting conversations that don't just focus on highlighting the problems, but also speak to some of the solutions that we might pursue to try to make a difference. Because making progress on this makes our economy better, and it makes our communities stronger.
Thank you very much. I want to make, just based on the last statements you made, I think this is so important because we have to figure out how to get from here to where you want to go through a political, cultural, and informational minefield that has been sown all across the world. Because when people are frustrated, they think they're stuck in their current circumstances. They become right targets for divisive nationalism. They think for attacking the notion of inclusion, for seeing themselves in a dog-eat-dog world where somebody else's gain is their loss. And we are still living with that every day in the United States. And that is impairing our ability to lead the world to a better place. So in every place, and I know the Director General is very sensitive to this because what she has lived with and experienced within Nigeria and in all the places around the world she's made better. So let's talk a little bit about how we can do some short-term inclusive recovery, because particularly for those of us who are worried about the survival of democracy itself, it's important to realize there's always a lag time between when you're doing something that makes sense and when real people feel it. And unfortunately, we need to do more today within cycles determined by elections and other things that enable people to feel something, even though we've got a very long project ahead of us, particularly in climate change. So let's begin with Secretary Raimondo. You have allocated billions of dollars to reducing some of the key bottlenecks facing the American economy, including $65 billion for broadband internet for all. And this is a big deal. I think most other countries would be astonished at the sheer number of Americans, without regard to race, who don't have access to affordable rapid broadband, either because they live in rural areas where the economics have not favored fast connections, or because they live in very poor urban neighborhoods. So tell us what you're doing with that.
Yes, thank you. So again, it's about breaking down barriers so everybody could have access to good jobs, good school. And we saw this in COVID. You know, those of us who were lucky enough during COVID to just go home and hop on Zoom, we could keep our jobs on Zoom. We could visit our doctors on Zoom. Our kids could go to school on Zoom. But if you didn't have broadband, you didn't get to go to school. Kids lost out on a whole year of school. They couldn't just go home. Or if you didn't have broadband and you were a small business, you probably went out of business. If you couldn't continue to see the doctor or a therapist, it was brutal. And, you know, being on the ground as governor, it's heartbreaking. And as you said, Mr. President, people don't know. 70% of tribal households in the United States of America do not have access to broadband. 35% of people who live in rural America, the greatest country in the world, do not have access to broadband. In more urban areas, there may be access to broadband, but if it's $100 a month, it's unaffordable and you might as well not have access to it. So what we are doing through this $65 billion is we are on a mission to make sure that every single American has access to high-speed, affordable broadband. And I'm determined to put this money to work in a way that doesn't just lay the fiber. You know, we need to lay fiber in rural areas and tribal areas, no doubt about it. But also, we need to do it in a way that provides digital literacy or provides money for hardware. If you have the internet but you can't afford an iPad, what good is that? So we've made sure to kind of write in the flexibility so you could pay for literacy or pay for the hardware you need. And also, and this is also heartbreaking and it's kind of in the weeds, but it matters. If you live in an affordable housing, high-rise apartment building, you probably, if you live in a city, your city has broadband, but it doesn't go to your apartment building. And so we just have to get the details matter. And we are determined to implement the $65 billion in a way so that at the end of it, really, truly every single American has broadband, and we finally close the digital divide in America, which is a huge contributor to the inequality and lack of inclusion. Every good paying job going forward is digital, is data, is tech. And so everybody deserves to participate, and that means having broadband.
I just want to emphasize, this is one of the great challenges of any democracy, but it's been paralyzing to America. More than 20 years ago, in my second term as president, I went to a tribal meeting in northern New Mexico to recognize a young Native American girl, 13 years old, who had won this big academic contest, and her prize was a computer. Now, back then in the dark ages of this, you connected your computer to the internet through a phone line. And she had this computer, and it was totally useless because they didn't even have telephone service. So her future was, you're a very smart girl, you got an unlimited future, here's your computer, I'm sorry you can't make any use of it. So it's not like we just discovered this. And through 20 years of fighting, and people, instead of building, wanted to fight over a small pie instead of building a bigger one, we have paid this awful price so that we still have all these people here. And this is going on everywhere in the world. The people fighting over a smaller pie. And we have to change it. So Director General Merchandise Trade failed in 2020. And it grew again in 2021. What's going to happen in 2022? And how can we make sure that we build supply chains in a way that don't undermine inequality, but reduce it? I mean, don't increase inequality, but reduce it.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me build on what both you and Gina have been saying. Yes, trade has rebounded quite strongly. We just released the latest figures. We had projected that in 2021, trade would rebound by 8%. But it's done even better by 10.8% this year, and next year by 4.7%. The strong rebound this year is based on the pent-up demand from many households and businesses, coming from the stimulus, the spending that was done during this crisis, which was quite appropriate. But hidden in those figures is something that people that we should not be happy or complacent about. Because you have a strong rebound that is happening in rich countries, in North America, in Europe, and there's a divergence in Asia too, especially East Asia. But when you look at the numbers in Latin America and Africa, you see a totally different pattern. So you have what one would say is a K-shaped recovery. You see it in the economic numbers, but also now in the trade numbers. The poorer countries are not doing as well. And there's a very strong reason for it. And so what I'm going to say now is that if we don't solve today's problem that we're facing of access to vaccines, vaccine inequality, we are going to see widening divergence between different parts of the world. The rich countries will be doing very well and the poor countries will do poorer. But the performance of the rich countries will not even be sustainable, because if we don't vaccinate everyone, we have all these variants that will come back. What we see now is that 2% of people in poor countries, in low-income countries, have been vaccinated, compared to about more than 60% in the rich countries. And I say to everyone that vaccine policy is economic policy, vaccine policy is trade policy. It's those who have access to vaccines who are doing well. The countries that don't are not doing well. So that's the inequity that we have to solve now globally, and we are not yet doing it well. Unless we solve that problem, we won't be able to even be confident that this growth in trade and all we see will continue. It will not be sustainable. And I think it's morally, practically, and economically unacceptable that we have this kind of inequity of access. And we need to solve it. I just want to say a word that from the point of view of the WTO, what we decided to do is to reach out. I know this is not fashionable, but we are thinking, what are the problems? How do we increase overall production in the world of vaccines? How do we get better distribution? We reached out to the pharmaceutical companies to find out what can we do working with them to help them produce more and distribute more. And we found they have problems with their supply chains. Their supply chains are very complicated, spanning 19 countries, sometimes for Pfizer, AstraZeneca, 12 countries, and export restrictions and prohibitions, from our members of the WTO can just stop a supply chain from working. So we've been working with them saying we will help to monitor what is happening and help to talk to our members so we can stop putting these restrictions and prohibitions as much as we can so supply chains can flow and you can produce more. In return, why don't you work with us so we see you scale up production of these vaccines, invest in emerging markets and developing countries. President Clinton, 80% of vaccine production is concentrated in 10 countries. And we've seen that when push comes to shove, countries can decide to close their borders when they have problems of their own. So we must decentralize production. All of these things are needed in order to solve this inequity of access. Let's do that. If we don't do it, we're going to find poor countries getting poorer, rich countries getting richer, and that's not the world we want.
Let me just basically echo what she just said. Our Clinton Health Access Initiative went to the World Health Organization, and we worked with them to make sure they did better this time than when Ebola hit, and they did. And my daughter, who's very outspoken on this, and this is her Chelsea's life is public health, says there are a dozen places around the world right now that could quickly ramp up again producing these vaccines with supply chain access that is much better than we have now. So I think we're going to have to make some hard decisions, because I don't believe that even though a lot of wonderful things have been done by the vaccines that have been given away by the United States and others, it's not a sustainable solution. We're going to have more problems like this. We have enormous advances because of the sequencing of the human genome. It's amazing how fast this vaccine was developed and distributed, or it would have killed the COVID many more people. But we've got to democratize and decentralize the production. And I thank you for saying that. President Bostic, let me just ask you a question that's related to this. We all know that COVID has actually had a disparate effect in the United States on small businesses, for example, and in certain regions because of problems with vaccine uptake. So what can we do to bring more of the positive benefits of broadband global trade and the efforts being made to deal with this health crisis to small businesses and in places within the reach of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, for example?
Well, thank you for that question. I really enjoyed this conversation because it's touched on so many important things. Now, when I go around the southeast of the U.S., particularly in smaller towns and in rural areas, the one question they ask me is, what can we do? How can we be more competitive for businesses that are thinking about where to locate? And then I tell them, look, when I talk to businesses, the first thing they say is, if we don't have access and consistent and continuous access to high-speed broadband, you're not going to be in play. That, for so many businesses today, is just basic table stakes. So these discussions around investing in broadband are so critical. Another thing people I don't think realize is that increasingly existing businesses are needing to have high-speed broadband as well. I've gone to a number of farmers and they tell me, so much of our business now is done in technology. And if we don't do that effectively, if we don't have ability to leverage that technology, we're going to fall behind and we're going to be less competitive. So these investments in broadband are critical. And then another thing I would just say on this is that there's a lot of research to suggest that health, and poor health in particular, is a dramatic negative drag on productivity and on economic growth. And as I think about the vaccines and the vaccination situation that we're seeing in this country in terms of take-up, but in other parts of the world in terms of just general access, that has direct implications for the amount of production we're going to have. And I hear a lot about supply chain disruptions. Vaccinations and the lack of access to vaccines is a critical and direct source of a lot of those disruptions. And so as we think about how we're going to move forward and have things play out in a better way, we've got to take care of our technology for sure, but we also have to pay attention to health, because if we don't have a healthy workforce, either in the United States or in other parts of the world, we can't produce the inputs to goods that we all want to have and need if we're going to live with a high quality of life. So both of these are just tremendously critical. And we see this, and I see this a lot as I go around the 6th District of the United States.
Thank you very much. Secretary Raimondo, you said something about childcare when we were talking earlier. There are 7 million women today who were in the workforce and say they would go back, but they can't access childcare. Now, this makes a larger point. We're trying to get an infrastructure bill passed through the Congress. And there are people who say, yeah, let's just do that. This other stuff doesn't matter. But the human resources are the key to every country's economy. So what I'd like to give you a chance to wrap up with is just how can we get maximum economic value equitably? If we don't join other developed countries in making it possible for people to succeed at home and in the workplace. What should we be doing? What are the most important things we should do?
Yeah. The answer to your question is we can't. We won't. We won't be globally competitive unless we make investments in childcare, in pre-K, because it's the only way that women can be productive members of the workforce. I'm going to give you a very concrete, specific example. I was talking recently to a guy who runs a very successful, high-growing software company. And he said that his best engineer was a woman, and he wanted to promote her. More money, bigger job. And she said, I can't do it because I'm struggling to piece together childcare for my kids. So I don't want the promotion, and I might have to go part-time. Now, how can you do it? Yes, we need infrastructure. You need a road to get to work. You need good, modern airports to do business travel. You also need childcare to enable you to go to work, be productive, keep down a job. And by the way, the people working in the childcare centers shouldn't be working 50, 60 hours a week and still living in poverty because they make so little. So, President Biden has asked me to take a lead on all things related to competitiveness. What will it take for our economy to be globally competitive? We better pick up our game and start investing more in America and the things that enable our human workforce to work and produce and have the skills they need. And I think we ought to be embarrassed about the fact that we're the only industrialized nation that doesn't provide childcare, and just get to the business of doing it.
Because I'm trying to set up the next panels and the rest of the day, I want to ask the Director General to maybe wrap up our section here by saying we've talked about all these things. I actually believe we could be approaching an explosion of economic opportunity. And we have the responsibility to do it in terms of figuring out how to avoid burning up the planet and destroying our children and grandchildren's futures. And so if you think about getting ready for more population, the equivalent of a New York City being present on Earth, one more New York City every few months for the next 3 or 4 decades, that's an incredible opportunity to do that and at the same time reduce the emissions that are generated by making things, growing things, using electric power. So how can we make sure that these stresses don't turn into a food fight of desperate people clawing at each other and instead provide the greatest opportunity for shared prosperity in history? How can we do, what should we be doing now to do that?
Well, thank you, President Clinton. I think what we should be trying to look at is not to juxtapose, to see competition, let's say, between trying to have low carbon emissions development and jobs. We need to see that in every challenge, there's an opportunity. And the question we should be asking ourselves, instead of how terrible this challenge is, for example, climate change, we should be saying, what opportunity does that present us to do things differently, to create new jobs, to use new technology, to encourage our young people their creativity and their inventiveness are women. And that's what we need to do if we are going to change the world. When we talk about, the fact that we have renewables, people say, well, if we are starting to phase out of fossil fuels, it will create a problem. And yes, in a transition period, it will. And we have to be cognizant that poor countries or countries that depend on these will need a just transition, time to adjust. But at the same time, we are seeing the price of things like solar panels, wind, and so on get cheaper and cheaper. And so how do we invest in that and create new jobs, different kinds of jobs than what we had before? So I think unless we have to change our mindset, our way of thinking, we have to tap into that technology that we see our young people coming up with and see how we use all of this. How will we feed the world without destroying the world? I feel it can be done. There are ways we can be responsible with agriculture and do it in a way that still lowers carbon emissions and helps us save the planet. Who has to do this? It has to be both public sector, private sector has to do its part, civil society and individuals. It's not any one person or any one sector. If we don't all come together and work on this and think creatively, then we're going to have problems. But guess what? I believe really, I'm an optimist by nature. I believe in the creativity of the human mind. Look at what we did with vaccines, for instance. We can find ways to make sure our young people are gainfully employed and that we build back better, as we say, make it real. We can grow and we can still have a planet that is sustainable.
President Bostic, I don't want to make you the only panelist that didn't get 3 bites at the apple. And I've got one question I want to ask that I think is really important here. Nobody expects the Federal Reserve to do the kinds of things you're trying to do. And I think that's one of the things that we all have to think about. We are all existing in relation to the environment in which we operate. We have obligations to people who may not seem at first blush to be our primary constituents. What can we actually do? And what can you do to close this digital divide in America? You made the case for why we have to do it and how we have to develop the potential of every person. But the reason I'm asking you this is I want everybody who attends all these panels to be asking themselves the same thing. We have spent too much time talking about all the stuff we can't do and how terrible the people who disagree with us are and how we need to, clean up the past. We need to, the three of you are where you are because of the remarkable aspirations you had and the support you got to get there. You just talked about childcare and the problem. Somehow the Director General raised 4 children, found herself a neurosurgeon, I think, to marry, and has happy grandchildren. The odds were against her on more than one occasion, but she was aspirational. So we have to have our heads in the right place to have any chance to get this done. So I've talked to a lot of Federal Reserve Board chairmen, and a lot of them were very able people, and a lot of them had a good sense about the economy. I've never seen one as obsessed as you are with things like closing the digital divide. So what can you do about it, and do you need partners?
Well, thank you for that, and I really do appreciate the kind words. Let me just start by saying, for me, the goal is to make sure we have an economy that works for everyone. That in today's world, where there are so many challenges and such difficulty that we have as societies and as communities, we can't afford to have people not giving their all and not getting a chance to give their all, and potentially not sharing their solutions and their innovations that can be the solution for climate change, that can be the solution for vaccine distribution, that can actually be the solution for childcare. We've done a lot of studies recently to show that part of the reason why the labor market is not rebounding as quickly as it might have otherwise is because we have a lot of mothers with young children who don't have answers for what's going to happen to their children and where they're going to be if they have to go work. So they're trying to wait and see what kind of infrastructure and wraparound is going to be there to make a difference. In terms of things to do, I think about this really in two ways. Like the big things, so we definitely need to be investing in broadband in ways that Secretary Raimondo and the current administration are talking about. We need to make sure that that children and families, once they have access to the high-speed broadband, have the computers and have the resources to cover the monthly payments. And we need to do all that at grand scale. So that's important. But a second thing that I've really tried to emphasize as I think about where solutions are is that small things matter as well. Like for us in our bank, we've adopted a school and we've tried to make sure that every student has access to a computer. The city of Atlanta more broadly has tried to engage with the private sector to have them step in and fill in the gaps where they might happen. And I know many individuals who have taken it upon themselves to work with their schools to find families that may not have the resources that are available. And let's all come together and make that happen. So to me, I think this is an all hands on deck situation. We have lots of challenges that we need to overcome. And I have to say, I'm an optimist too. I think all of us on this panel are optimists. We wouldn't be doing what we're doing if we didn't have that as part of it. And I have to say, my optimism has not been disappointed in terms of seeing the response of people from so many different communities and so many different walks of life to actually do things to make a difference. And that's been fantastic. And I'm looking forward to that continuing in the weeks, months, and years to come.
Thank you very much. I want to end on an upbeat note because I think that people too often disempower themselves by being just overwhelmed by what they're facing and disappointed by what others do. We should better focus on what we can do to build. And I think the most important thing about this panel is the example that you all present to other people who share your aspirations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, President Clinton.
Well, thank you.